Now, the alphabet starts with A, which would mean today should be Arizona, right? So I'm sure there'll be a few Coyotes fans amongst my. There should be amongst my subscriber list due to the fact that I cover all 30 teams. But Arizona is a relatively easy team to cover, and it's relatively quick. This is not going to be easy or quick. So if you're one of these people who doesn't enjoy longer videos, and I don't know, I'm kind of on a time, um, this would be the time to go ahead and shut her down. And I'm serious. If you are one of these people who has the idea that, okay, I'll give it a shot. This is a journey through the Bruins' existence, and it means I'm pulling out this book. Yeah, I got it for $5, and it covers 100 years of hockey. It's not kidding. There are some interesting things in here because I said when I got into the teams, the original 6, there's a lot of stuff that's happened well before I was born, well before almost any subscriber on this channel was born, and it's important to know where you came from to know where you're going. Now, the Boston Bruins have been the most frustrating team to follow if you're 93 years old. of the original 6, they would easily be the most frustrating to their fan base if anybody's 93 years old and can remember all the seasons. They're also, and I will admit this as a Bruins fan, they are the team that is most likely, when you look back on some violent, horrible incident, they're likely to be the cause of it. Philly came into the league in '67, and the Broad Street Bullies got a lot of attention. But the Boston Bruins, from day one, from the days of Eddie Shore, have been the team that, due to the fact, I believe, that Toronto and Montreal got all the Canadian talent, because before the draft it was if you're from Quebec, if you're French, you play for the Montreal Canadiens. If you're in Ontario, you play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. This is why Montreal and Toronto built up so many Stanley Cups before expansion. Montreal kept building Stanley Cups after expansion because they're smart. They were a very smart team in the 70s and early 80s. So Boston was left not getting the best players. So what you're left with then is looking for truculence, as Brian Burke would say. And Boston has really, really enjoyed their truculence over the years. And admittedly, and I say this as a Bruins fan, if I followed this team for 93 years, I doubt very much I'd be a Boston fan. Because a lot of this stuff is not fun. Let's look at a couple articles out of this book, shall we? By the end of the 1923-24 season, the NHL had survived 7 tumultuous years and had finally established 4 healthy franchises in Hamilton, Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. The league was ready to expand south of the border. Charles Adams, a wealthy New England grocery store entrepreneur, and Tex Rickard, a boxing promoter from New York, were both eager to bring hockey to the United States. As summer rolled around, league president Frank Calder, that's who the Calder Trophy is named after, was also reviewing applications for a second Toronto team and a team in Philadelphia. That application is still in the league office now. They'll get back. Trust me, Toronto. They'll get right back to you with that second Toronto team. In addition to hearing the pitches from Adams and Rickard, Rickard had withdrawn his application by late August, having grander plans to build a larger version of Madison Square Garden. Adams, however, was still very much interested in the league franchise for Boston. In the fall, he came to terms with the league to acquire an expansion team for $15,000. Adams' first move was to hire Art Ross as coach, yes, that Art Ross, and general manager. A multi-talented athlete with a pedigree that included boxing, baseball, and football, Ross had played over a decade in the amateur leagues and in the National Hockey Association. His last appearance as a player was a 3-game stint with the Montreal Wanderers in 1917-18. Their arena burned down. That was it. Meanwhile, although the New York bid was postponed, a second Montreal team was interested in joining the NHL, presenting complications to Boston's ambitions in the process. Cecil Hart was actively gathering players for a franchise that would oppose the Canadiens in his hometown, even though the league hadn't officially given its approval. Can you imagine that now? Can you imagine just somebody comes out and goes, yeah, so I'm putting together a team here. It's a second team in Toronto. and we're going to challenge the Leafs. We're joining the NHL. The NHL goes, no, what? No. Eventually, on October 12th, 1924, the NHL awarded new franchises to both Boston and Montreal. So it was like, look, I got a team. All right, whenever you're in. Which named their clubs the Bruins and the Maroons, respectively. What a maroon. Anyways. Adams, who had an affection for the color brown, gave his team brown sweaters with gold stripes. The league's newest members faced off against each other for an inaugural game in Boston on December 1st. The Bruins prevailed 2-1. And this would be the last time the Bruins prevailed in much of anything. It was a rough first year for the team in Beantown as the Bruins finished last in the 16 league with a record of 6-24. Playing before sparse crowds at Boston Arena, the team had fewer fans for their games than the local amateur teams were able to draw. Unfazed, Ross was able to guide the Bruins to a fourth-place finish the next year. Sprague Cleghorn became a key off-season acquisition in boosting the team's fortunes. Legendary defenseman Eddie Shore came on board on 26-27. 2 years later, the Bruins were hoisted in the Stanley Cup for the first time. By then, Boston was an elite team in a 5-team America division that included teams in New York, Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. The Pittsburgh Pirates. The Philadelphia Quakers were a team that briefly flirted with NHL as well. I'm not going to get into that one. I already talked about that, actually. I'm not going to get into that one either. At 6'2", Dick Clapper towered over most players of his generation. 6'2". This is 1945. Entering the NHL as a 20-year-old in 27-28, Clapper went on to forge a career that lasted 2 decades on the strength of his durability and versatility. Clapper was placed on the right wing along with center Cooney Weiland and left winger Dutch Gaynor to form the Dynamite line. In his second season, Clapper contributed his first playoff goal as the Bruins won the 1929 Stanley Cup, the first championship in franchise history. The 1929-30 season was a breakout year for the Newmarket, Ontario native. Clapper and Weiland were a formidable duo, finishing as the league's top 2 goal scorers. Weiland, who also won the scoring championship with 73 points, netted 43 goals, beating Clapper's career best total only by 2. The next season, Clapper was named to the second All-Star team. He repeated the selection again 4 years later in 1934-35. Then, in 1937-38, Clapper was shifted to defense. Imagine that. Chicago Blackhawks have announced that Jonathan Toews will be a defenseman next year. What? The Bruins had the Kraut line of Milt Schmidt, Woody Dumart, and Bobby Bauer to carry the scoring and needed to fill a void on the blue line. Can you imagine calling a line the Kraut line now? I'm thinking that wouldn't fly. Paired with Eddie Shore, Clapper was just as effective in preventing goals as he had been in scoring them. Boston captured its second Stanley Cup in 1939. Clapper was named to the first of his 3 consecutive first All-Star teams as a defenseman. He remains the only player in NHL history to be named an All-Star on the All-Star team for both forward and defense. Another Stanley Cup followed in 1941. The next year, Clapper, for the first time in his career, had his season curtailed by serious injury. He played just 32 of 48 games after a bad tendon kept him off the ice. Nevertheless, Clapper persevered. In 1945-46, he took over duties from Art Ross behind the Bruins bench, becoming a player/coach. In 46-47, Clapper played in his 20th season, becoming the first player in league history to reach the milestone. He played just 6 games that year, but he set a benchmark rare for any player to accomplish over any era. One of Clapper's most infamous moments occurred when the Bruin punched a referee. Let that sink in. Bruin punched a referee. Keep that in mind as I read the rest of this part. Incensed that a penalty wasn't called after Clapper had been butt-ended in the face by the Maroons' Dave Trottier. The official was future NHL president Clarence Campbell. Clapper escaped with a $100 fine. No suspension. He punched a referee in the face. Immediately after his retirement, it gets even better. Immediately after his retirement, Clapper was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, becoming the first player to have the 3-year waiting period waived. Punched a referee in the face. You're going straight in the hall, boy. We like your moxie. That's our kind of guy. He punched a referee in the face. Can you imagine? Here I was not too long ago, given the business to, a couple of guys, Eddie Shore and Chris Pronger, and there's Dick Clapper right in the face, and yeah, you're going straight in. You're going straight in the hall. Yeah, that's just crazy. There was another one in here. There's another one in here. No. Okay, this is the last one I'll read. As I delve into the before I became a sentient human being, before I was in existence portion of the Bruins franchise. No player in the history of the game had a season as extraordinary as Bobby Orr did in 1969-70. Yes, Rocket Richard electrified the Forum in Montreal with his successful pursuit of 50 goals in 50 games. Nobody's ever going to do that again. A quarter century earlier, and indeed, any of Gretzky's 4 200-point campaigns, 4 more than anyone else has ever played, were born of exceptional brilliance that may never be witnessed again. Yes, I know, Lemieux had 199 in 1 year, but it's not 200. But Orr's historic 4th professional year in hockey trumps them all. The Bruins superstar single-handedly, superhumanly transformed the defenseman position. With exceptional skating, accurate passing, and a deadly shot, Orr reinvented the role of a blue liner, from a player solely tasked to prevent goals to a skater who could consistently contribute to the offense. By mid-January of 1970, Orr had recorded 51 assists to break the single-season record by a defenseman, previously held by Chicago's Pat Stapleton. And there were still 36 games, almost half a season, remaining in the schedule. Orr's remarkable compilation of points continued on March 15th against the Red Wings. The two-time defending Norris Trophy winner had 2 goals and 2 assists to become the first defenseman ever to register 100 points in a season. 1 week later, he matched the output of that night's score sheet in a 4-point effort against Minnesota, giving him 79 assists. The mark established a record for the most helpers in a season by any player, either forward or defenseman. By the end of the year, Orr had collected 33 goals and 87 assists for 120 points. He shattered his own mark of points in one season by a defenseman, 64 in 68-69, nearly doubling the tally. The next highest scoring rearguards that season were Oakland's Carol Vadnais and Toronto's Jim McKinney. They each had 44 points, or just over 1/3 of Orr's historic total. Orr became the first defenseman in the history of the game to win the Art Ross Trophy as the league's scoring champion, beating his teammate and runner-up Phil Esposito by 21 points. He also claimed the Hart Trophy as most valuable player and easily claimed his 3rd consecutive Norris Trophy. Then came the playoffs. The Bruins claimed their first Stanley Cup since 1941. It's a long time. Orr flying through the air as he scored the game-winning goal in overtime. He capped off the season of a lifetime by earning the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP, becoming the first player in history to win 4 major awards in 1 year. Bobby Orr's flying through the air goal. There's an interesting postscript to that. Yeah, it was a beautiful goal, and he was flying through the air after the puck went in, and it was overtime, but they swept that series. There was no real tension to it. The Blues weren't a real threat. So there's your pre-era stats. Now, with those storylines behind us, and I didn't even get into the Wayne Mackey-Ted Green incident, where they swung their sticks at each other, and the whole not wearing a helmet thing weighed against Ted Green, and he ended up in the hospital with a fractured skull. And there's the incident between the Bruins. Well, I mean, the Bruins go into the crowd, and Milbury beats a guy with a shoe. Like, there are so many things that the Bruins have been involved in. There's the Marty McSorley incident with it's in here. There's the stick swinging incident involving Marty McSorley, of course, against Vancouver. And there have been numerous incidents. There's Milan Lucic in the lineup telling Emelin he'll kill him the next year. There are numerous incidents involving Bruins that I can't defend. I can't. And as much as I would like to, Brashear was the one that McSorley hit. As much as I would like to be able to defend my Bruins from their nefarious, notorious history, I can't. I really can't. Don't open to Arizona in the book, because you're tomorrow. Boston's history reads thusly. It's 93 years. Well, this is their 93rd season. And they won the Stanley Cup in 29, 39, 41, 70, 72. Should have won it in 71, and they didn't. They famously were in line for a Stanley Cup when Don Cherry had too many men on the ice, and Montreal came back and won. Montreal had a superior team, but Boston should have won that series, and they should have won the Stanley Cup. But they didn't. And the end result is what matters. So it doesn't matter if you should have won. You didn't. And too many men on the ice. It's in this book too, the too many men on the ice thing. I wasn't going to read about that one because that's been covered so much. I think because Don Cherry's still in the public eye. And because it was such a dramatic moment that it's been covered to death. So I don't need to cover that when I talk about the Bruins. But the Bruins have a history that is full of heartbreak. Let's see. Lost the final in 1927. They lost the final in 1930. They lost the final in 1943. They lost in the final in 1946. They lost in the final in 1953. They lost in the final back-to-back in 57 and 58. They then missed the playoffs from 1960 till 1967. They had abysmal point records. In 70-game seasons, their point totals went thusly. 64, 43, 38, 45, 48, 48, 48, 44. Then expansion took place, and they became an 84-point team the next year, and they were in the playoffs from then until almost forever. But they did lose in the final in 1974. They lost in the final in 1977. They lost in the final in 1978. They lost in the final in 1988. They lost in the final in 1990. They lost in the final in 2013. You want blue balls? Be a Bruins fan. But they did win the Cup in 2011. I was very proud of them winning that. That is the one Stanley Cup they've won that I was around for. Boston is a polarizing franchise and has always been a polarizing franchise, right back to their initial existence. Maybe they went with brown and gold for their jerseys because they hated everybody, and secretly at some point somebody's going to come out and say, we've always hated hockey, and screw you guys. But the bad boy reputation for Boston is well-founded. It is. Let's take a look at career leaders in Boston, shall we? Because that's really going to show it. Games played, the leader is Ray Bourque. Ray Bourque is the class of an organization that's not known for its class. 1,518 games Ray Bourque played in Boston. Johnny Bucyk second with 1,436 games. Don Sweeney is third. Don fucking Sweeney is third with 1,052 games. Let that sink in. The team's been around for 93 years, and number 3 on games played is Don Sweeney. You know why? Because he was a damn good defenseman. I loved Don Sweeney as a defenseman. Wayne Cashman is 4th with 1,027. 5th is Terry O'Reilly with 891. You want to talk about a guy who's polarizing. 6, Rick Middleton with 881. 7, Don Marcotte with 868. 8, Dallas Smith with 861. 9, the aforementioned Dick Clapper with 833, which says a lot considering how much shorter the seasons were back then. So when you got 48-game seasons and you end up getting over 800 games played for one team, that's pretty amazing. Patrice Bergeron, at the time that this is recorded, sits at 10th with 824 games. Patrice has been a warrior for my Bruins. Now, goals scored. Johnny Bucyk leads with 545 goals. Phil Esposito is second with 459. Rick Middleton's third with 402. Ray Bourque is 4th with 395 on the blue line, which was very impressive. Cam Neely is 5th with 344. Ken Hodge is 6th with 289. That's, of course, Ken Hodge Sr., not Ken Hodge Jr., that played like 3 seasons for the Bruins in the early 90s. I like Ken Hodge Jr. a lot, but he didn't last very long. Wayne Cashman is 7th with 277. Bobby Orr scored 264, is 8th. Ninth is Peter McNabb with 263, and I remember Peter McNabb from the 80s. I like Peter McNabb. 10, Patrice Bergeron with 239. So Patrice is within shouting distance of moving up that list. Assists, Ray Bourque is 1 with 1,111 assists. Second, Johnny Busick with 794. Bobby Orr's third with 624. Phil Esposito's fourth with 553. Notables in here, it's pretty much the same guys. Bergeron's in ninth with 380. Adam Oates is 10th with 357. Cam Neely owes at least part of his Hall of Fame existence to Adam Oates. Oates got him to 50 and 50. Points, Ray Bourque leads the way with 1,506 points. The best defenseman I ever saw. Got to be one of the best in history, right up there with Bobby Orr. Johnny Busick, 1,339 points. Phil Esposito, 1,012 points. Middleton, 898. Bobby Orr, 888. Career shortened, sadly, by injuries. Terry O'Reilly with 606 finishes ninth on that list. Cam Neely with 590 is still in 10th. So if Brad Marchand thinks he's going to be tops in that list, he's got a ways to go. Penalty minutes. Now, I said, we're going to go through some rather infamous names here. Terry O'Reilly is first in penalty minutes with 2,095. Mike Milbury is second with 1,552. Keith Crowder is third with 1,261. Fourth is Ray Bourque with 1,087 because he played so many bloody games he got penalty minutes. Fifth is Wayne Cashman with 1,041. Eddie Shore is sixth with 1,038. Ted Green, fractured skull and all, 1,029. Fern Flaman, 1,002. Lyndon Byers, 959. Dallas Smith, 936. So there's your penalty minute totals. Now, I figured I'd also look at their power play totals, because when you get into the original 6 teams, you're getting into like a pretty hefty list. There's no real flukes in here. Ray Bourque leads the way with 164 power play goals. Phil Esposito at 153, Johnny Busick 136, Cam Neely 129, Rick Middleton 102, Ken Hodge 79, Bobby Orr 74, Patrice Bergeron 69, so he's moving up that list. Zdeno Chara has 67, so he's top 10 all time in Boston's power play goals list. That says something. Keith Crowder has 64. That's an unusual one. I would have not bet on Keith Crowder being top 10 in any offensive list for the Bruins, based on the amount of time he was there. Shorthanded goals. This was interesting to me too. First is Rick Middleton with 25. Second's Derek Sanderson with 24. Don Marcotte and Phil Esposito are tied with 20 for third. Brad Marchand at 19. Marchand is within shouting distance of number 1 all-time on the Bruins shorthanded goals list. Wow. Eddie Westfall, 18. Bobby Orr, 16, and he's tied with Greg Shepard, Steve Kasper, and Brian Rolston. Kasper's role as a defensive forward was it was underrated, I think, in his career. He was a very good player. Now, goaltending records. Goaltending isn't really what Boston's been known for, and there's a reason. Their number 1 wins all-time is Tiny Thompson with 252. Frank Brimsek is second with 230. Jerry Cheevers, 229. Tim Thomas, 196. So if Thomas had played that season, he decided not to, he could have been as high as second on this list. Eddie Johnston had 180. Tuukka Rask is at 170. So Tuukka, realistically, if he spends the next 4 or 5 years in Boston, could retire as the number 1 wins leader, which is weird. They don't have a single guy with 300 wins. Gilles Gilbert had 155. Andy Moog, 136. Byron Dafoe with 132 is in the top 10. And Jim Henry has 93. And I don't know when he played. His name is in here. I also looked at the losses category. Eddie Johnson had 193. So he had 180 wins, 193 losses. Tiny Thompson's in there with 153. Frank Brimsek had 144. Tim Thomas had 121. Byron Dafoe had 104. Tuukka Rask had 103. Jerry Cheevers 101. Jim Henry 98. So he had 93 wins, 98 losses. Andy Moog 75. So he had 136 wins and 75 losses as a Bruins goalie. Not bad. Gilles Gilbert had 73. So that'll drive people nuts who think that winning and losing as a goaltender doesn't matter. Let's see. Save percentage. Save percentage shows the difference between this generation and the one before. Tuukka Rask has a .924 save percentage, is number one for Bruins in that category. Tim Thomas, .921 is second. Byron Dafoe, .911 is third. Get this, Andrew Raycroft, number 4 with a .908. And then it just gets ugly from there. John Graham is number 5 with an .899. Robbie Tallis is 6th with an .894. Bill Ranford had an .891. Andy Moog had an .886. This is where I say the previous generation shows up, because Moog and Lemelin were good, and yet Moog had an .886. Lemelin had an .884. Doug Keynes had an .877. So that's their top 10 in save percentage. Save percentage is definitely one of those stats that you need to look at as weighted between generations. I know points and goals and all that need to be as well. And there are books that get into that now, and there's websites that certainly say, here's your adjusted stats to compare today's scorers with 20, 40 years ago, how those all work out. I think it's a strange way to look at it, because it's a different generation, it's a completely different system, it's a different game. So to say, well, Gretzky would have had 159 points last year because we've adjusted, we don't have a way to really know, because we don't know how Gretzky would have played in this version of hockey. So, anyways, shutouts. Tiny Thompson leads the way with 74. Frank Brimsek second with 31. Tim Thomas is third with 31. Frank Brimsek had 35. Tuukka Rask 30, so he's within shouting distance of second place. Nowhere near first. That'll never happen. Jerry Cheevers 26, Eddie Johnson 27, Byron Dafoe 25, Jim Henry 24, Hal Winkler 19, Jules Gilbert 16. So there's your all-time leaders for Boston, and honestly, compared to all-time leaders for Toronto or Montreal, it's kind of an anemic list. And I think compared to Chicago and Detroit, it's kind of an anemic list. And maybe even the Rangers. I would say that of the 6 expansion teams, and it's hard to say this, the least successful overall over their entire histories. Chicago would probably be the least successful if you really look at it, but Boston would be a close second. I know people would point out that, well, the Rangers didn't win from 1940 till 1994, which is true. But in terms of the results, Boston and the Rangers, oh man, it's hard to say. It is so hard to compare, okay, over the last 100 years, Boston's record since the 80s has always been relatively good. Okay, let's take a look at it just from a numbers point of view. The Bruins have won 3,000 games in their history. So they've won 3,021. I just don't want people coming back later and going, you were wrong. Chicago's won 2,637. So Boston's won 400 more games. In the playoffs, Chicago has won 264 games. Boston's won 299. They've lost 304. Chicago's lost 266. And they're catching up to Boston in the playoff wins category. Rangers. The Rangers in their careers have won 2,705 games. And in the playoffs, they've won 238. So, okay, fine. I'll look up Detroit, too, but I'm 99% sure that Detroit's, especially over the last 20 years, been better. Detroit has 2,858 wins. In the playoffs, they have 325. And they have 11 Stanley Cups over their livelihoods, compared to 7 for Boston. Take a look. Hey, I told you guys this was going to be a long video. Don't tune out now. Don't get mad at me now. I warned you thusly. It's going to be a long, painful video looking at the history of the Boston Bruins. It's a long, painful history to look at. Come on. Get past. I just got this book, so I'm still learning where everything is in here. I know there's a table of contents. I know, I get it. There's this year's draft, all the other drafts before that, All-Star teams, Hall of Fame, Stanley Cup winners. Because this will show, there we go. So yeah, Montreal's the all-time leader, of course. Then Toronto, Detroit, Boston's in 4th place in terms of the original 6. Ahead of Chicago and the Rangers for Stanley Cup wins. But Would anybody be surprised if Chicago wins the Stanley Cup in the next 3 to 5 years? No. So for Boston right now, they're a team that has been through it. And if you look back, the original Stanley Cup final, it was a 4-game series. Ottawa beat Boston. It was 2-0-2, so they allowed ties in the playoffs. Imagine that now. Boston's first Stanley Cup win was a 2-0 series win over the Rangers. Then they lost to Montreal 2-0. This is going to be a theme. And they beat Toronto 4-1. They beat Detroit in a sweep. They lost in a sweep to Detroit. They lost 4-1 to Montreal. They lost 4-1 to Montreal. God damn it. They lost 4-1 to Montreal. They lost 4-2 to Montreal. I hate this. Then they beat St. Louis in a sweep. Then they beat the Rangers in the final 4-2. Then they lost 4-2 to Philadelphia. Then they lost in a sweep to Montreal. Then they lost 4-2 to Montreal. Then they lost 4-1 to Edmonton. That was after they lost in a sweep to Edmonton. And then they lost 4-2 to Chicago in 2013. So that's all their losses. Their wins in 1970, they swept the Rangers, and then they won in 7 over Vancouver in 2011. Vancouver is very good at losing in Game 7s and Stanley Cup Final. But so that's the history of the Rangers, the Boston Bruins, a team that has some pretty good records in here. 121 points is the record in 1970-71, which is an impressive point total considering there were no overtime losses, no shootout losses, and it was only a 78-game season. So it's 4 games shorter than the seasons are now. Their fewest goals were 147 in 1955-56. Fewest goals against were 172 in 1952-53. Their longest winning streak was 14, but that was back in 1929 and 1930. Their longest losing streak was 11 in 1924-25. Their longest winless streak was 20 between January 28th and March 11th in 1962. Most seasons, 21 played, was Johnny Busick and Raymond Bourque. So Dick Clapper would be second on that list. And I got into all the totals. Where's the one I'm looking for? Most penalty minutes in a season was an 87-88. So not even considered one of their bully years. And 2,443 penalty minutes for the Boston Bruins in 1987-88. That's a lot of penalty minutes. A lot. So, Bruins fans, if you're out there, I feel your pain. I wear my Bruins gear with some pride and shame at the same time this year. And honestly, of the teams for the original 6 that I would pick to choose to cheer for, they're in the middle in terms of pain. I think if I had picked up the Rangers in the late 80s, I think I'd be in a lot of pain right now. If I'd picked up the Blackhawks, I would have been in pain for years. And then all of a sudden, over the last 5 years, I'd feel great about myself. Detroit, that wasn't going to happen. I love Yzerman, though. And then there's Montreal and Toronto, of course. Toronto's been nothing but pain since '67. But still, when you look at overall franchise records over the last almost 100 years, Toronto is still ahead of Boston. There's no bragging rights here. I guess of the 3 teams I've picked, I haven't picked any team that I cheer for that is an easy team to cheer for. But Boston's record over the years has been filled with controversy. People who hate the Bruins, I totally understand why they hate the Bruins. Totally get it. There are moments where I've watched Marchand. There were moments with Milbury. McSorley, as I mentioned earlier. There have been moments where I say, as a hockey fan, I cannot excuse that behavior. and I will point that out this year. Pasternak, at the time I'm taping this, just got assessed a 2-game suspension. That's in line with what I thought he'd get. I think if he had really targeted Girardi's head, if he had really followed through and smoked him, you're looking at a 10-game suspension. As it was a dirty hit. It would have been a clean hit 20 years ago. Everybody would have been queuing it up and saying this is a great hit. But it's another mark against Boston. Boston definitely doesn't get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to these things, and I understand why. Anyways, that's my history of the Boston Bruins, and that's it for that topic. Tomorrow I will be covering the Arizona Coyotes because I work tomorrow, and Arizona will be much easier to cover than just this huge, huge ball of Boston. And the ball is either a ball of hate, a ball of love, or a little bit of both. And in my case, honestly, it is a little bit of both. Back when this was their logo, there's a lot of things that went on that I say, wow, really? And I think you can find that with any team. You know, even Montreal fans can admit there have been dark moments. If you look back far enough, you can find dark moments in any team's history. The Rocket Richard riots come to mind. The big one. What is it with Clarence Campbell being the target? Clarence Campbell was in the crowd in Montreal, and they were going to kill him. I mean, they were worried about his life in that game. And here I am in this video talking about Clarence Campbell getting punched in the face as a referee. But from what I've read about Clarence Campbell over the years, he was kind of a nasty prick too. So that's hockey. Hockey is a history of nasty pricks. And hopefully your team of nasty pricks is doing well this year. Mine is not doing so well. But in terms of 93 years, there's some Stanley Cups to make up for some misery. So it could be worse. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to y'all again soon.